Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Yountville Town Council special meeting of Tuesday, December 14th. I will call this meeting to order, and if we could please have a roll call of the council.
Councilmember Hall.
Here.
Councilmember Moeller.
Here.
Councilmember Dornbecker.
Here.
Vice Mayor Chilton.
Here.
Mayor Dunbar.
Here. And just a reminder to everyone in the audience that tonight's meeting is being broadcast live on Channel 28 and will be rebroadcast this Friday at noon, and it's also being streamed live on the townofyountville.com website. So we will move straight on to the Pledge of Allegiance, item 4, and if newly elected Councilmember Dornbecker would please lead us.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you very much. We'll move on to item 5 of the agenda, which is public comment. And I don't know if we have any members of the public that would like to comment. The fact that nobody's moving, I'll take that as a no. Now, I don't see on our agenda that we are adopting this agenda. Is there a reason that we don't have that item on here?
You normally have a modification of agenda, but when you have a one-item agenda, there's really not a whole lot to modify.
Fair enough. Then I'll move right on to item 6, which is a consent calendar, which we also do not have. Then we will get to item 7, which is why we're here. Consideration of a resolution regarding a water and wastewater financing plan. Resolution number 2936-10. And what we will be doing is receiving a report on this rate study. And with that, we could have a staff report, and then we'll listen to our consultant's report as well.
Thank you, Mayor and Council. A little background. As most of you are aware, the Council directed staff during the discussions in last year's budget when it was pointed out that the wastewater and water enterprise funds had structural operating deficits, that this was not a sustainable business practice. The Council directed staff to address and develop a business plan to resolve the structural operating deficits of both the Water Enterprise Fund and Wastewater Enterprise Fund. The Town Council formed an ad hoc committee comprised as of the December 7th, 2009, which was former Mayor Cindy Saucerman and Council Member Margie Moeller, to work with staff on 2 phases. One, to develop the RFP and selection process for a rate study consultant, and then secondly, after the council selected a rate study consultant, to continue to work with as the council liaison with staff and the rate consultant, and ultimately to bring back a recommendation to the town council. Over the past 3 months, the ad hoc committee has met a number of times with town staff and our consultant, Bartle Wells, and I'd like to introduce Doug Dove and Kat Singh, who are here. And what we're looking at here is a financial plan and ultimately the rates necessary. The goals of the rate study, based on what the council asked us to do, were to ensure fees and charges could be distributed in a fair and equitable manner, eliminate a general fund or other subsidy over the next 5-year period, not in 1 year, but a phased 5-year approach, and to ensure the long-term fiscal health of the water and wastewater enterprise funds, which are currently operating with an annual deficit. Importantly, the new rates include all expenses necessary to ensure the financial self-sustainability of both funds, repayment of the 5-year rate softening loans from either the general fund or a water drought reserve fund on a fully conforming basis, the accumulation of appropriate capital reserves to ensure the integrity of the water distribution and wastewater collection systems, and in the case of the wastewater enterprise fund, the recommended the recommended rates have to ensure the ability of the fund to cover the debt service necessary for the town to construct and complete state regional water quality control board permit conditions of approximately $2.4 million in capital infrastructure and expansion to the town's reclaimed water system by 2014. Several items were used in the study conducted by Bartle Wells Associates to ensure that the proposed rates would be fair and equitable to all customer classifications. The consultant reviewed our long-term capital improvement plans, the Regional Water Quality Board permit conditions, the town's 5-year capital infrastructure plan, current and projected revenue requirements, as well as a comparison of our existing revenues for our current rate by customer class, and also performed a cost of service analysis. The cost of service analysis took into account our various customer classes and allocated cost. The analysis also evaluated a change in the water rate structure from our current approximately 30% fixed charge, 70% commodity consumption structure to either a 50-50 or a 40-60. An important note is that the town is a wholesale purchaser of water from the veterans' home and the state, and does not have direct control of the cost charged by that agency. California Government Code AB 3030 allows for a wholesaler to pass through increases in water, provided that we comply with the various provisions of Section 53756. In terms of our planning, we've evaluated 2 different assumptions of increases in the costs from the veterans' home. One assumption is a 7.5% increase each year over the next 5. The other is 10. And over the last 5 years, we've actually experienced a 50% rate increase. We'll go into that in more detail. More importantly is the whole process for raising rates has changed significantly since the town last completed a rate increase, in which I will point out the last rate increase was in 2007. Proposition 218 requires that the town provide all property owners, and I want to stress that, that's the state laws, provide property owners who are charged a fee for water and or wastewater service with a notice of any proposed rate increase. The notice will be sent to these property owners, allowing for a minimum of 45 days in advance of the town council public hearing on a proposed rate increase. Property owners have a right to protest the proposed rate increase up until the close of the hearing. If a majority of the parcels file written protests to the town prior to the close of the public hearing, in accordance with Proposition 218, the town cannot move forward and implement the proposed increases. If a majority of the parcels do not protest, then the town council has the authority to move forward and implement not to exceed the proposed maximum notice rate increase. In accordance with Prop 218 requirements, the town will take several steps to comply. A draft of a proposed Prop 218 notice is included in your packet, and we've identified February 15th, 2011, and I apologize, we all have to get used at this time of year to our transition to the new year, but the public hearing would be February 15th, 2011 at the as part of the council's regular meeting. We will also provide a quick link on our website to all of the various information related to the proposed rate increase, background, the study, PowerPoint slides that you're going to see later. And we'll also have a copy of the Prop 218 notice and the explanation. The town will also offer an informational meeting to discuss the proposed rates and ensure that all of the information on the proposed rate increase is posted at our 3 public notice posting process, as well as placing a notice in the Yountville Sun. Bartle Wells and Associates is here, and I'm about to turn the meeting over to them, so they will in depth go through the process of what the study. What you're being asked tonight to do is, 1, is to file and receive the rate study, and actually what we've correctly titled the Water and Wastewater Financing Plan and Rate Study 2010. Approve the attached resolution which establishes the maximum water and wastewater rates which will be utilized in the Prop 218 process, as established by the town council. And I want to stress, the council can adopt ultimately a lower rate increase than what you send out in your proposed notice. However, you cannot adopt an increase higher than what you send out in your proposed notice. And we're also calling for the public hearing to be scheduled February 15th, 2011 at 6 p.m. And we're also approving the Prop 218 notice and also the procedures. You'll note there's an attachment in the resolution that outlines the administrative procedures for conducting the Prop 218 process. And then the final element is to direct staff to finalize and implement all of the necessary activities based on your final decision today on your maximum proposed rate, if you choose to do so, with regard to completion of the Prop 218 notice, setting the hearing, and moving all the public information together. So with that, I'd like to turn it back over to Doug and Kat, and we will go through the rate study, and then we will also have some introductory comments then at that point in time from Councilmember Moeller, who can also, representing the ad hoc committee, talk a little bit about the large number of scenarios and discussions that were vetted and ultimately narrowed down to a smaller number to bring to the full council for consideration.
And actually, before we do that, I'd like to ask if the council has any questions about the staff report before we hear from our consultants. Anybody have questions? Vice Mayor Chilton.
And maybe if Steve, if you tell me that you want to save this for the presentation, the Prop 218 notice, which is attachment 3, this is what will be sent to all of the, well, I think you said property owners. Okay. And in terms of its, we have some blanks in here, I think, which is what we'll determine tonight. I saw dollar blanks. Was the intent to be percentages in there, or was it going to be actual dollars on average? What's Prop 18 require? Or 218,
it requires showing what the rate is, which is the dollar.
Okay.
And it's very simple. As you can see, the components are straightforward. The format will go out. We will insert the various charts based on the scenarios that you approve. Staff anticipates we'll probably spend the better part of tomorrow or the next day's fine-tuning before we would get it to the print shop. We clearly want to get it to the print shop with plenty of time so that we don't have any mix-ups. But you are correct. The Exhibit 3, I would call it a sample, and what you're directing staff to do is to implement whatever the decisions you make tonight and to finalize that particular document.
Okay. Thank you.
Does the council have any other questions about the introduction of this item? No? And does our member of the public have any questions at this point of the staff report? We will be offering an opportunity if anybody does, if any additional public arrives, they will be able to comment on this hearing. So with that, we'll turn it over to our consultants from Bartle Wells.
Thank you very much, Mayor Dunbar, and good evening, everyone. We have a rather lengthy set of slides, so I'd like to keep this informal, and if you have any questions along the way, consider it like a workshop, and please interject and stop us, and we'll try to address those right away. We're going to talk first about water and then about wastewater, and basically I think the key word is sustainability, and right now your water and wastewater enterprises are facing deficits, and we want to take care of that problem, have them stand on their own, and also fund replacements for aging facilities. You've got a system in place, a wastewater treatment plant, wastewater pipelines, you've got water pipelines and pumps and so forth. And those are wearing out as we use them. So we're going to propose funding replacement of those on an ongoing basis. It's kind of a sustainable asset maintenance level, the highest level that you can do. Instead of putting Band-Aids on problems, having a proactive approach to fund it and take care of it, which is, in the long run, the cheapest way to handle your utilities. Our study objectives were to do 10-year cash flow projections and long-range financial plans. and determine your annual operating and capital revenue needs, review your cost allocations with the Veterans Home and all the customers, develop rate alternatives that reflect the cost of providing service, and we're going to have a number of alternatives for you to consider. We'd like to consider phasing out the subsidies from the general fund so that the utility can stand on its own, recommend minimum reserve fund targets, and then phase in rate increases over time to help minimize impacts on customers, and also will assist with the public outreach and the Prop 218 compliance. And just briefly, an enterprise fund, which the water and the wastewater funds are they're funds that are self-supporting and also similar to solid waste and other funds. They generate revenues from charges to users mainly, and they pay their costs just like an enterprise would. And that includes debt service, repairs and replacements, and system maintenance and operation and water purchases. Right now, you're subsidizing these funds with some general fund money, and that's not the healthiest way to go. The healthiest way is for them to be self-sustaining and self-supporting. So we've developed rate recommendations that do achieve that. And briefly, financing methods. Pay-as-you-go financing is using cash and revenues from your rates to pay for projects. Usually that is most appropriate for recurring expenses such as annual repairs and equipment replacements. You don't want to borrow for annual expenses and operating. Debt financing is typically used for spikes in capital costs or major projects to spread out the costs, so current ratepayers don't have to pay the entire cost all at once, and that lets future ratepayers pay as they also benefit from the long-term projects. And we've looked at a number of options for funding some projects, and we're going to recommend state revolving fund loans for the wastewater project. We don't envision any borrowing for water, so that water would be pay-as-you-go, but for wastewater we are going to talk about state revolving fund loans. And when you do borrow, you have to maintain your revenues at a certain level to make the lenders happy, and that's usually 125% of the annual debt service.
It should be 120.
120%.
It's 125, but for the state revolving fund loan, it's 120.
Yeah. But that extra 20% is usually used for capital projects and ongoing maintenance. So it's not like you're generating extra money that you don't need. Next slide. All right, water utility, just basically the last increase was in 2007. You have about 769 connections, and residential accounts for about 87% of the customers. Your budget, you had a beginning operating fund balance of about $464,000, and again, your revenues were about $562,000, and your expenses were above that, about $778,000. So you had about a $216,000 net deficit. That's the budget for this year. So you can see the ending fund balance is lower than the beginning fund balance, and that's not sustainable. You've been in a deficit mode and over about the last 10 years, and over those 10 years, the general fund has pumped about $3 million into the water fund. That's a substantial subsidy, and that's, when you divide that by 769 connections, you're getting close to $4,000 per connection. That's put in by the general fund. So water sales, your rates and charges account for 97% of your water enterprise revenues. And your annual use was about 142 million gallons. And the average single-family bi-monthly water consumption was 22,000 gallons. That's average over the whole year. Here's the graph of the general fund subsidies that were put into the water. And again, that's money that can't be used for town projects, various, other uses that it could be used for. Most water utilities are self-supporting, and you know, no general fund subsidy is included in most cities' utilities. The water rates include a service charge, which is fixed based on your meter size. If you have a larger meter, you pay a larger fixed charge. And there's the same charge for residential and non-residential on the water service charge. And that's generally levied to recover the fixed cost of the utility, your salaries, supplies, repairs, stuff that doesn't vary with water use. Then you have a water commodity charge, which is the volume charge, and you have 4 tiers of increasing cost as water use increases. And you have, right now, different tier breakpoints for single-family residential, multifamily, and non-residential. And your rates provide a nice conservation incentive. The top rate is over $6 per 1,000 gallons. And it recovers the costs that vary based on the amount of water sold. And so your volume charge should be proportional to your volume, you know, your variable rates, electricity, water purchases, other variable costs that vary based on the amount of water used. Right now, you're charging about 72% of the revenues come from the volumetric charge and 28% from the fixed. And when we looked at your costs, we found that they were closer to 50 to 60% fixed and 40 to 50% variable. So right now, your rates don't reflect the town's proportion of fixed versus variable costs. Here's just a summary of your current rates. You do have higher rates outside of the town, and you've got, on the volume rate, you've got single-family, 4 tiers, and then multifamily, 4 tiers. Non-residential is a uniform rate, and then you have some industrial, and I don't believe you have any industrial customers, so. Domain? But they don't get water from you, I don't think. Yeah. So. Your accounts break out as 672 accounts are residential, and you've got 97 that are non-residential. And you've got 29 that are considered hotels and inns, 14 restaurant bars, and 18 that are town accounts. You've got 560 single-family homes, 35 single families that are outside the town, 21 condos, 4 mobile home park accounts, and 52 multifamily residential accounts.
Can I ask a quick question?
Sure.
Go back to that previous slide. For Prop 218 purposes, is this how you determine a vote if you have one person who has multiple connections, or is it by, how is that determined
By
property?
parcel.
Okay.
So if there's 100 mobile homes, I'm just making up a number, on one parcel, then that's one vote.
Okay, I see the mobile home park is 4.
Yeah,
We don't have 4 mobile home parks, so I assume that one of them maybe has 2 connections.
probably.
But
Yeah.
they get still one vote for the parcel?
One vote, yes, one vote per parcel.
Okay.
It's 4 counts because they each have they have a irrigation, thank you, irrigation account for each park.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, I have a question also, please, and that is multi-residential, meaning apartment dwellings, is that true?
It can, although I will also point out, typically multifamily is apartments, duplexes, things like that. Some of our multifamily have actually opted to have each of the units individually metered, so I just want to make sure you're aware of that. But again, that again will necessarily be one parcel, depending on how the ownership, which is where in a condo you actually have individual ownership. So there's a couple different operating nuances.
And another question I have is, what is the ratio of water usage versus commercial versus residential customers? I mean, usage.
think it's in the report.
I see on page 4 of Table 3, on page 4 of,
Yes,
is that it?
yes.
So that's the volume that,
Total use for the whole fiscal year.
the fiscal year. Thank you.
The chart is on page 5, the pie chart.
Yeah, I'm looking at the volume.
No, it's actually right here. 60%.
In gallons used.
60% is residential use, 40% is
It's at the bottom of Table 3.
On the bottom of Table 3 on page 4, it says total residential use was 60%, and total non-residential use, meaning commercial, is 40%.
Thank you.
That's pretty consistent for the past 3 years.
And so, let me just, if I could follow up with that commercial versus residential question. When we have a hotel that has a residential unit or units, how is that calculated?
A hotel,
Or a business that has we have a business that has a residential unit. We have hotels that have residential units.
So mixed, they would be mixed use?
yeah, I guess it would be mixed
So
use.
is that how they would be classified?
The ones that come to mind are Hotel Luca, which has 2 units. That would just be part of the hotel. I don't think they have a separate meter. Sorrento is upstairs, so I believe they're on the same meter. They wouldn't have a separate meter for the residents.
But those classifications would then be commercial use, even though there's residential consumption.
Right, because the majority is a commercial business.
Okay.
One other clarification for the council and the public's benefit. You'll note the town is listed as a customer. We actually buy our own water. We are not we don't get it for free. So our uses we also pay for. I just want to share that because that's not necessarily the case in all organizations, but we do treat it that way here as well, as a true enterprise fund.
Thank you.
Next. So the town's main source of water is the Rector Reservoir, which is owned by the Veterans Home, and it's rainfall runoff. In 2009, the town distributed 476 acre-feet, or 155 million gallons of water. In the current budget, 2010-11, we're projecting 510 acre-foot of purchased water from the Veterans Home. Maybe a little bit less, but that was the budget number. And your water system includes the Yountville Municipal Well and 6.9 miles of water distribution mains. And this is just a schematic of the water system from the coastal and civil engineers. And your water consumption is the pie chart, which is from the report. You can see single family is the largest chunk there. Hotels and inns are 15%, and quite a number of other uses. The water, from a financial standpoint, you have a number of funds. The main one is the Water Utility Operating Fund, Fund 61, and that accounts for water revenue from user fees, operating expenses to distribute water to customers, purchases of water primarily from the Veterans Home and conservation efforts. And within that, there's water operations and treatment and water purchases and conservation. Then you have a Water Utility Capital Improvements Fund, Fund number 60, which is for the acquisition of water improvements and major equipment. Then you have a Water Drought Reserve Fund, Fund number 57, which is established by council policy to account for $2 million reserve that's established for water purchases in the event of a drought. And the Water Connection and Impact Fee, Fund 58, accounts for your connection and capacity charges from new development.
And if I could, I want to clarify, especially for the new councils, we've talked in previous budget workshops about the fact that the town, while we have impact fees and revenue, it's really a declining revenue base because we have limited new development that is going to pay impact. So we have a small number of parcels that may contribute an impact fee. So again, from a practical, long-term standpoint, impact fees will not be a viable funding source for the town.
And these are the fund balances as of July 1st, 2010. You had about $22,000 in the water utility operating fund, a little over $2 million in the drought reserve. The connection impact fee fund had no dollars, and the water utility capital improvements fund had about $441,000. So about $2.47 million in the fund. However, $2 million of that is restricted for drought purposes. And why do we need a rate increase in the water? Well, we've got an operating deficit. We've been filling that in with general fund subsidies over the past 10 years.
I'm sorry, can I ask a question on
Sure.
the previous slide? Maybe Kathleen, you can help with this. If I go to page 20 of the rate study itself, and I do that because it talks about the 2010-11 budget and the fund balances that are existing, the 400, I read that as at the end of the year, we're going to have a fund balance of $247,904. Is that cash in that fund? Does that include depreciation? I know I've asked this question, Kathleen, before.
Right. It wouldn't be pure cash necessarily. And yes, we do record depreciation as an expense, so, but it's not a cash expense, as you know. Does that answer your question?
So is there, I heard you guys say that you think that's cash. I don't know.
I assume it's cash, based on, from the reports that Kathleen gave us.
I guess I'm curious if it's actually
I believe they were
higher,
cash.
if depreciation is
The
included.
reports you gave me were cash, it wasn't
Okay.
depreciation.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's cash balances.
Yeah, at the end of the year.
Thank you.
Second thing is the water purchases from the Veterans Home. The largest expenditure for the water utility is nearly 50%, 54% of all operating expenses, and that cost has gone up 50% over the past 5 years. So we hope that that doesn't go up quite as rapidly as that in the future, but it's really in the control of the Veterans Home, and we're not expecting any big capital improvements or anything that would push that cost up rapidly, but you know, the state's in pretty serious financial straits, so they're looking for revenue any way they can get it. We also have the capital improvement program over the next 5 years, about $440,000 in capital improvements, including main replacement, water meter replacements, pipes and blow-offs, and pressure pit upgrades, and upgrade to the groundwater management plan, and also a fire flow study. So a number of capital improvements over the next 5 years. And then operating expenses, we used cost escalations of 4% for personnel services and 3% for other expenses, except for the water purchase. And we've got a couple of scenarios on the water purchase increase. So this just shows the projected expenses over 10 years. And you can see the yellow, which is the water purchase, is potentially the largest increase there. The capital is not that significant, and the operating cost increases at 3 to 4%. But it's that water purchase that we really don't know how much that's going to cost. And here's the history of the water purchases. Going back to 06-07, the cost was $500 per acre foot. In 10-11, it's $750 per acre foot. So the average has been a 10.8% increase over those 5 years. Can you go back to that one? Thanks. For our water rate projections, we've used two scenarios. One is a lower annual increase of 7.5% a year on the water purchase, and then the second is a 10% water purchase increase. Now, we would also propose a pass-through provision in the rate structure that would allow you to raise the rates if the increase on the water cost is higher than what we build into the rate structure. So if we go with the 7.5% and the rate comes in at 10, well, there would be a pass-through provision where you could pass through that portion of the cost increase to ratepayers without going through the whole 218 mailing procedure, which would be nice to not have to go through that. So the history of the cost of water purchases you've got here, it was $260,000 in 06-07, and it was $361,000 in 2009-10. So we're projecting it to be $382,500 this year. So we can see quite a bit of increase, and that's part of the reason we're here trying to, justify a rate increase. And your capital improvement program, the 5-year capital is about $442,000. One rate structure modification we recommend is for the fixed charges. As I mentioned, the fixed charges increase with the meter size, and that's because a larger meter can place a higher demand on your system than a smaller meter. And so that's the standard way of allocating fixed costs. And your ratios are slightly off of what the American Water Works Association recommends. And that's kind of the largest water trade organization in the industry, the American Water Works Association. So we're just recommending that you bring your meter ratios into agreement with those AWWA ratios.
And Doug, if I could just jump in here for a second. This is one of the variables that is going to affect the first-year rates. So we're going to talk about the rates in a minute, but this is just one of those scenarios, or one of those variables that's going to affect the change the first year. So it's not going to be just everybody gets the same change the first year. So just keep this in mind, and when we start talking about that first-year rates, and then after the first year, it's pretty consistent.
Excuse me, Graham, can I ask you then, the great percentage of single-family homes, for example, what size is their meter? Or is it
think
all over?
three-quarter inch.
Three-quarter
Yeah.
inch.
Yeah.
And for later also, you'll see the scenarios of what's the effect on a single-family residence, and we use a 3/4 inch meter. We also look at commercial, which is a 2-inch meter. So we'll try to do a comparison of what's this effect of these rates on these typical property owners.
Okay.
You have tiers on your volume rates, and your current multifamily tiers, you can see there, it's Tier 1 is 0 to 2, and billing unit is 1,000 gallons. And then Tier 2 is 3 to 14. Tier 1 in the single family goes from 0 to 8 billing units. So, imagine if you have a fourplex and your Tier 1 allotment only goes up to 2 billing units, whereas if you have just a single family home, you get 8 at that lowest Tier 1 rate. So it's really not fair. And we're recommending that we change this structure to a uniform rate, and it will be the same as your commercial rates. So regardless of whether you have a fourplex or a 10-plex or whatever, you pay, the same commodity rate, no matter how many units you use. And that's real standard in the industry. So this, basically what this does right now, the current rate structure puts most multifamily customers into Tier 4, which is the $6 rate. And that's, very expensive. So
the intent would have been conservation,
yeah,
but it's
Right.
unrealistic, you're saying?
yes.
Well, it's more unfair, because the issue becomes if you have an apartment complex and you have all these units and all these people, they jump to the Tier 4 rate at the beginning of the month, where a single-family home may never get past Tier 1. So it's to try to make it more equal to all the water users.
And then your outside-of-town rates, you currently have 35 water customers that are outside the town limits. I think you only have one wastewater customer. And currently, the fixed charge is 78% higher than the in-town fixed charge, and the commodity charge for out-of-town is 25% higher. And because you've put so much money into subsidizing the utility over the past 10 years and beyond, we're recommending that you go with a 75% surcharge for out-of-town customers. And that, those folks are not, they've never paid an annexation fee into the town. They can stop service at any time and go with some other water source. So, we feel that the 75% surcharge is fair on this, and that's very common in the industry.
The wording of your recommendation, I just want to make 100% sure I'm clear on that. It makes it sound like it should be 75% of, it's actually a 75% on top of?
Yes, so they would pay 175%,
Okay,
whereas an in-town would pay 100%.
thank you.
Yeah.
Well, I seem to recall there being an issue of the legality of, so you're saying this is an industry standard so that is defensible, that the additional costs and risk factors, if you will, to the town serving those people warrants the 75%, where we used to have an even higher rate, if I remember, several years ago, and that was determined to be not defensible. In
Yeah,
terms of that
I've seen the rates vary from 25% surcharged up to 150% above, the user rate for inside of the town. I think 75% is very reasonable and defensible based on your subsidies of the water system.
And if I could, I think that's the key. You have to keep looking at what's the differential. But here in our particular case, they don't contribute property tax. They don't contribute other revenue that has come into the general fund, which has been used to maintain, enhance, or purchase the water that they're actually getting. So, we'll have to monitor that scenario. 10 years from now, that may not be the appropriate factor, and that might need to be lower when the equivalency factor, if you will, is adjusted. But at this point in time, it does seem very justifiable.
And just to follow up on that, I'm assuming at some point you'll mention the fact that we're not just arbitrarily setting a fee to make a profit on this operation, that
Right.
we can't do that. So this is just trying to cover the cost of the system.
Right, it's trying to be fair to everybody, that your existing customers inside the town, that, the town has used its revenues over the years to subsidize the cost and basically pay for a lot of, capital and facilities and operating costs. And so we're just trying to spread that cost fairly.
And I think just to expand on that, Mayor Dunbar, you're absolutely correct. One of the operating nuances between a public utility and a private utility, for example, Cal Water, or some of the other private mutual, the town is not allowed by state law to make a profit. We have to be able to substantiate and can only charge what our actual operating costs, including the capital system replacement component, are appropriate.
But can I ask a question? Does that mean, though, that if we're to put aside money, say, I think the 30% target you're going to get to in a moment, that's appropriate
fine,
for a
yeah.
cost for us
That's
to put as a
appropriate
reserve?
because that is actually what you're building the reserve to use for your capital
Precisely.
replacement. So that's actually considered an appropriate and in many cases a industry standard.
Right, okay, thank you.
The replacement fee, as I mentioned, we were talking about sustainability, and we want to put money into replacement of the system as it wears out. And we're looking at putting aside the estimated depreciation on the system each year. And that would be a special water system capital fee, a replacement fee that would be on your bill. It would be shown clearly and earmarked for capital projects and replacement. So that would help keep your system in good working order and fix things ahead of when they break down and fail.
And we're proposing to phase in when we get to 2015-16, that's when we'll be fully funding annual depreciation. But in the meantime, we're proposing just to phase it in. I believe it's like 20, it's even increments, just to minimize the impact on customers.
And you can see we're starting in 11-12 with $2.26 bi-monthly, and then that phases up to about $12, which is the full depreciation amount.
And the funds would go directly into the capital fund.
So one question about this, with regards to the fees and the rates that we're going to be evaluating and looking at in the proposal, these are included in those rates?
Correct.
Okay,
Yeah.
so these are not incremental to the rates? Okay.
When you add this, the replacement fee with the fixed charge and the commodity charge, you would get your total rate increase.
Okay.
And this is another one of those variables that it's not a straight percent, that you'll see some
So we'll
variability.
have the variability, particularly in the first year?
Right.
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
And your fixed versus variable revenue recovery from the rates, as we mentioned, the current is 28% fixed charge and 72% from the volume or variable charges. And option one that we're going to consider is 50% fixed, 50 variable. And option two is 40% fixed, 60% variable. And that's basically to mirror your actual costs. They're somewhere in the 50-50 to 40-60 range. And when we do this, when we go to this higher fixed percentage, that affects certain customers more than other customers. For example, if you're an out-of-town part-time resident and you only come up on weekends, you're probably not using that much water. And so now this would increase the charge for those folks because they'll be paying more on their fixed charge.
And I'd just like to add here that probably, we've mentioned a couple of the other variables that are going to affect that first year when we get in there, but this here has probably the largest impact on those first year rates that we'll see. So as we've asked you to keep in mind some other things, this will probably be the predominant variable that will have that effect.
That'll drive the change in the first-year rates going out?
Correct.
Because after that, it's basically, as we presumed, whatever the rate increase that we'll propose.
Right, the replacement fee and some of the other fees we talked about will have some impact, but this by far has the largest impact on those first year. And we'll probably talk about that in more detail later.
And then the scenarios, we did the 10-year cash flow projections and, the whole bunch of assumptions going in. Essentially, we need a $220,000 loan from the general fund
Or the drought fund.
or the drought fund to cover some deficits in the first 5 years. But that would be paid back by 2015-16.
We refer to that as your rate softening contribution. Otherwise, your spike would be even worse.
And also, we're assuming the first rate increase takes effect March 1st of 2011, and that future rate increases are effective January 1st of each year, beginning in 2012. And it's good to put the rate increases during the winter months, because that's when consumption is the lowest, and it lets people really adjust as their water usage increases during the year. They can adjust their water usage if they want to see a lower bill. When you put the rate increases in on July 1st, then that hits people right at the peak of the summer, and they get a big surprise, and a lot of times you get more complaints that way. So we've found that putting the rate increases in the wintertime is the best way to go.
And I just want to jump in again. I think I've mentioned this before, that typically half of all the water use is for irrigation on a typical single-family home. So that's why in the summer there's so much more water use, and water bills are higher during the summer than they are during the winter. But we do take that into account when we're doing some of the variables for looking at winter water usage to set the rates. So it's sort of flat for everybody. So it takes out that variability of the irrigation when we're looking at the rates.
So if I can, before you go off this slide, the Water Drought Reserve Fund, I thought was off limits, being restricted, but you're saying it being a potential loan, that would be acceptable?
It's a policy option for the council. I would also say that you're looking at you're booking an obligation, it would be a formal, it has a repayment structure obligation, and you're looking at something that is not substantially, it's roughly 10% of the equity of the drought reserve fund at 220. Again, ultimately, that's a council policy determination, as was implementing the policy. And again, you're not looking at a taking from the fund, you're looking at a borrowing with a repayment and a commitment that is paid back within 5 years.
But I also remember distinctly the conversation that the council at that time had, which was this was supposed to be a fairly steadfast commitment to that fund.
It's an option, again, that the council has on two choices, because if you're looking at, you're potentially looking at having to come up with several $100,000 on loans for your two enterprise funds for your rate softening. So it's a tool, and again, that's a council option as to whether it's a general fund or a capital projects fund could potentially be used, although there's no capital project that this is funding, this is going to operating. So from a premise standpoint, that fundamentally, I do think it's a policy decision, and I think the council would have to weigh that. Again,
Using that same logic, the council could then change that $2 million to be $1 million and then transfer $1 million into the operating fund instead of a loan.
I think the loan option, Mayor Dunbar, was by doing that, it stays consistent, so you're not fundamentally changing the overall balance. But again, that's, the council wrestled, as you recall, with the initial decision and the allocation, and I think the question would be, what is that dollar amount? And again, I think here the real key is by having it be booked as a loan, you're not reducing the overall availability. So I think, again, we're trying to present options to the council. You don't necessarily have to make that decision tonight as to which fund or structure.
Just to follow up on that, the Water Drought Reserve Fund, if memory serves correct, when you talk about it being a policy decision, that's a reserve fund that's not restricted in the same way that an enterprise fund dollars are. We did not transfer that money into the enterprise. I think that's still within the general fund.
It is part of the water enterprise.
Is it that
It
one we
is
did
in a
last?
separate fund, and it's restricted by the council.
But as the mayor just said, I don't believe it's, unless we change that, it's not legally restricted to that use. I mean, the determination, and you're right, we wrestled with it, there was some
It's
disagreement
not
about
restricted in the sense
whether
of
we
an
could-
external restriction, but it is restricted by the council's resolution.
Correct, but unlike the enterprise fund, we could not transfer money out of an enterprise fund just to fund parks and recreation, for example. But I'm not saying we should do this, but we have the discretion, the policy decision of the council that we could do that if we wanted to. And I'm not advocating that, but we have that leeway.
The council has the policy direction to go back and revisit the initial policy and the allocation, yes.
But we could do that.
Yes.
I'm not saying we should. Okay, thank you.
Mayor Dunbar, could I also add one thing now that we're on this subject? Once we have this in more detailed discussion about which fund, another thing to consider is if we do borrow it from the water drought reserves, in case we needed it, we would only need it in multiple dry years. And that would really mean that we'd probably have to have 3 to 4 to 5 extremely dry years when we wouldn't have enough water in Rector, we wouldn't be able to perhaps use our well, and we'd really would need this $2 million to buy water on the spot market, if you will. So that was another consideration. If we do choose to use it from the Drought Water Reserve Fund, we'd be paying it back in 5 years, which in the worst-case scenario would be the time we would really need it. It would all be paid back because we'd have to have multiple dry years to need that money. So,
Thank you. Any other questions on this particular bullet point, or shall we continue with the presentation? You never know when the big bullet point's going to pop up, do you?
I only have one question on it, and it's maybe semantics, maybe not as relevant at this juncture because we'd be paying ourselves, but, I mean, is there a standard by which we would loan this money and/or rates that we would consider?
Council has, municipalities have previously booked loans either at a no interest or market. The ad hoc committee was recommending a no interest loan on this particular one for the purpose, but that again is a policy decision of the council. You could put an interest rate factor in. There has been a previous loan booked that I believe the water fund actually has a loan from the capital projects fund with a 4% interest towards it. It has to repay the municipal wells. So again, that would be a policy. That, of course, would potentially slightly raise the rates that you're talking about. So in this particular case, for a lot of factors, it was felt that this option should be kept alive for the council's consideration.
I have a question.
Yeah.
And that is that since 50% of water use for single-family residences is for irrigation, was there any thought given to or any exploration into recapturing the gray water from those residences to use it for the irrigation?
I'll take that one for you, Doug.
Go ahead.
I think, Marita, the answer there, Councilmember Dornbecker, you're looking at two structures. One, the town has a proactive policy on looking at things, but in order for us to address the immediacy of the necessary rate structures, that's not in place to be viable. There's another factor also that can go in place, which the town has started and probably needs to expand, which is also a different kind of conservation approach, which may be looking at how do we encourage more drought or Mediterranean or climate specific, maybe I shouldn't say Mediterranean, but landscaping that's reflective of the climate we actually live in. So I think as we go further, we do need to include gray water, but right now it's not established, there's not enough of a commodity that it would have any particular impact on the foreseeable period that we're in. And we're also dependent on those homeowners choosing to make the investment necessary to implement the gray water in order to have it. But I do think that needs to go on the list of sustainable practices that the town looks at. For everybody's information and recall, if you may, the new homes on Stagg's View do have a gray water system included in their new design, so that is something that the town is addressing. But unfortunately, because we're principally built out, to convert existing will require the homeowner to bear the burden of the investment, and didn't seem like it quite fit into the equation nice and tight right now.
And the other thing I'd like to add on that is, even though the town has grown with more hotel rooms and all, our water use hasn't increased a lot. And I think part of it's like Bardesano Inn is having more water conservation, either in the building code or setting their own design, architectural design. So even though we are bringing on more users, we have not had a big increase in usage. So we're not purchasing a lot more water, even though the town's been growing, not quickly, but has been growing. So I think with new water conservation ordinances coming out in the future, which will address landscaping for new development, it will continue to lower our usage, which then, of course, then we don't have to purchase as much from the Veterans Home. And then also part of this capital project is our recycled water program and our projects. So part of this rate increase would go towards the debt service for building those projects, so we'd be recycling more water. So that's one of the other advantages. It's not exactly gray water, but it's along those lines of recycling and sustainability.
Thank you.
So we have three water rate scenarios. The first one is the 50-50 fixed variable, and with a 10% cost escalation in water purchase cost from the Veterans Home. And as we mentioned, the first year rate increases vary because we're phasing into a different rate structure with 50% fixed. The first year, the full increase is on the service charge, and so the current tiered rates would be the same. Subsequent increases would be applied to both the service and the commodity charges. And the commodity rate is the same for non-residential and multifamily, so we're blending those two classes of customers together in the commodity rate structure. And then again, outside town customers are charged 1.75 times the amount in-town customers are charged, beginning March 1, 2011. And this this alternative we have for 18% increases overall, and that you can see in the beginning we have a $216,000 deficit, and then we gradually reduce that down to where we have an $86,560 surplus in 2014-15. And then again, we have a small negative in 2015-16.
That's when we repaid the loan.
Okay, so that's the year. You can see the expenses jumped up there in 15-16. So that includes repayment of that $220,000 loan.
One question.
Yeah.
That when you refer to rate adjustment, that is the volumetric rate, is that correct?
Actually, it's a revenue.
It's a revenue.
Yeah, so 18% increase in the revenue.
Okay.
Yeah.
I have a question. I'm going back to the detailed appendices that were provided. Are these numbers different? Have they been modified?
For the water, they are. Because in the report, as Councilmember Chilton pointed out, we did not show the repayment of the $220,000 loan.
Okay, that's fine. Thank you.
So the impacts, a current bill for a typical residence, about $67 bi-monthly. That's every 2 months. And so the first year of increase would go up to $91.19 bi-monthly, and that's a $23.35 increase. And then $16.40 increase per month or bi-monthly the next year. And again, a $19.35 bi-monthly increase on 13-14.
Those are all 18% increases, beginning in 2012-13 to 2015-16.
Right. And then a typical commercial bill with a 2-inch meter and 115,000 gallons. Currently, you'd be paying about $390 bi-monthly. That would go to $529 bi-monthly. And then the following year would go to $624 bi-monthly, and so on. Scenario 2 is again the 50-50 fixed variable, but with a 7.5% assumption in the imported water cost, the purchased water. Go ahead. And in this scenario, the overall revenue increases are less because we're having a lower increase on the purchase cost. So we have 17% increases, and again, you can see we're paying this back in 2015-16, the $220,000 loan. But we maintain fund balance, positive fund balance throughout. The impacts are a little bit lower. For 2011-12, it will be a $22.90 bi-monthly increase for the residential as opposed to 23 and change. And then for the commercial, it would be about a $136 bi-monthly increase.
$2 savings, I guess you would say, compared to scenario 1.
And then let's look at scenario 3. In scenario 3, we have the 40-60 split of fixed and variable with the 7.5% assumption on the cost of purchasing water.
And also, the rate increases for this scenario will be applied to both the service and commodity charges for the first year and the future years.
And so this is 17% increases. Again, essentially the same as what we showed last scenario because we have the same revenue increases. But with the 40-60 split, The typical residents would see a dollar change for the first year of $16.53 bi-monthly, as opposed to the $23. And basically, this shifts more of the cost to the volume charge, which puts more of the cost on the high users. So large users would see a higher cost and be a little bit more of a conservation incentive. For a commercial bill, 2-inch meter, we'll be looking at about $104 bi-monthly. So that's about $52 a month increase on that.
And before I move on to the next one, one of the things that, by going from the 70% to a 50%, when we have a drought, which we seem to have every 10 years or so, people start conserving, so we sell less water, so we have less revenue. So it ends up, people say, oh, well, we need to raise the rates because we had a drought because people aren't buying water. So by doing the 50-50, it evens that out more, so we have a higher fixed rate based on the meter. So it takes some of that ups and downs when we have a drought out of the equation.
So you can see your rates currently are at the low end of the scale for surrounding communities. 67.84 bi-monthly. It's the lowest around. Calistoga is currently at about 185.50 bi-monthly. St. Helena, 161.54, so quite a bit higher than your current rates. Your customers are enjoying a nice low cost of water. And the Howell Mountain Mutual Water Company is really expensive, $357.30 per bi-monthly period, so that's pretty steep.
And Santa Rosa and St. Helena both have proposed rate increases going into effect January 1st, and the rates shown here are based on those January 1st, 2011 increases.
I also just want to mention some of the variability on these is, every system is different. So each agency has to get a permit for their wastewater treatment plant or have certain capital improvement projects, deferred maintenance, capital projects. So there's labor costs, whatever. So it's, we can do a comparison here, but, I just want to say that every agency is unique and has to affects their rates in different ways. So this is just up here for, comparison, but I wanted to keep that in mind, that if we get hit with a big permit cost in the future, that our rates could be higher for that reason.
And this chart also shows in the light blue bars are the scenarios 1, 2, and 3. Still staying, pretty much on the low end of the cost, even with the increases.
I do think what this shows, though, is that the rates that were being proposed are not out of the norm. And in fact, if you recall, when we calculated our average monthly subsidy, it was $31 a month. And if you plug that into our current rate, you ironically see where our scenarios are, and guess what? We're right about average. That's going to put us at plus or minus $90 a bi-monthly or $45 a month.
So if I can just ask if there are any other council questions before we kind of tied up this water conversation for now, anyway. I think council probably had opportunity during the presentation, and if one more?
Yeah.
Vice Mayor Chilton?
You were referring to scenario 3, which had a 60-40 split instead of 50-50, and it puts a higher burden. You could call it a penalty on high usage. Is there, if you look at the fixed versus variable cost components, is there forget about the meter size, but is there a higher cost to the enterprise of servicing on a fixed cost basis high volume users versus low volume? So if you had a single family residential with 3/4-inch pipe that used very little water versus one that used on the high end of water, is that, no pun intended, pretty much a wash? I mean, is that not really a factor in any significant way?
The fixed cost?
Yeah. In terms of servicing that
Yeah, I think if you have
Fixed cost
a
side.
user that's really peaking out, especially in the summer months, that may, hit you at a time when you're at peak use. so you're using all your facilities. And I think that could arguably be considered more expensive than people just using at average rates and not requiring those larger sizes of facilities to meet the peak.
But there's not, I mean, maybe Graham, you can address it. There's not really, there's not more service calls by our staff. There's not really a big issue with that on, I would assume that the meter size really kind of determines that more
Right.
than
Yeah,
within its own
there's not
class.
a much bigger usage if you have a bigger meter for our crews to go out and look at those things. But the other thing is just that water rates, a big part of that is just what we pay the Veterans Home. So they do have capital costs, which we're paying off as part of those rates. So I don't know. You want to add anything to that, Steve?
And I think part of the question you're also answering, Vice Mayor Chilton, is our system is heavily loaded on residential units. I mean, that is 87, I think, roughly of our population base. So many communities have a more distributed model where you have a diverse commercial base, some industrial users, and those other classes can be adjusted. We just don't have a lot of variability. I mean, most of our community is residential, no matter how we slice it, whether it's a mobile home residential, a multifamily residential, or a single-family residential. And you're basically correct. The core, what I would say, our fixed costs for staff, the administrative oversight of the water system, all that stuff's really about the same on a connection basis. There might be a little bit of cost component difference on a meter replacement or something like that, but a service call to go out and fix something, monitor something, do the annual compliance work that we have to do, we're doing that, and that's also why staff is, strongly recommending the 50-50, because we do need to cover that cost. And I think it was addressed, there's less variability to that, because the interesting thing for us, if I put my, make the most money hat on, we wouldn't encourage conservation. But in California, we wear two hats. We realize that water is a very valuable and finite resource, and we actually do want to encourage conservation, which is why we sort of have this structure that allows for us to have a variable rate structure, and yet we also know that in a drought, there's another situation we also have, which is in a really wet year, that irrigation use is reduced. So that also potentially has less revenue. So that's why at some point, we're recommending both the 40-60 and the 50-50 are significant changes from our current structure, but we do think the 50-50, we know it's a little more of a burden the first year, but I believe, and Councilmember Moeller can comment more, but we really felt when we looked at the modest, when you really got right down to it for the first year, we were talking $3.
Okay, thank you.
And before we move on to the wastewater conversation, I just want to offer the public an opportunity to either ask a question or make a comment to this portion. No? All right. So if you're ready, we're ready for wastewater.
Okay. I think we're more than halfway done, so hang in there. Again, overview of wastewater. Last rate increase was 07. You have less accounts in wastewater, 628 residential accounts and 79 non-residential accounts. Residential is about 94% of your accounts. Your beginning fund balance was about $488,000. We're looking at a deficit for this current fiscal year of about $63,000, and your ending fund balance after that would be about $425,000. And your wastewater fund has been in the deficit mode for quite some time. The sales revenue, charges for service, is 96% of your revenue. And the Veterans Home accounts for about 42% of the revenue on wastewater. You have, your system consists of 8 miles of piping in town, about 3/4 of a mile of force main from a pump station to the waste. You own a wastewater treatment plant. 1.4 miles of gravity discharge piping from the wastewater treatment plant to the river. So you're discharging to the river in the winter time, and you also have recycled water. So during the summer, you don't. I believe you don't discharge to the river at all. You recycle all of your water and that is distributed to vineyards and other uses through force main recycled water lines. And I highly encourage you to get a tour of the wastewater treatment plant. I always find those very interesting, and it's a big asset of the city. So if you get a chance, take a look at that and see how that works. You also you treat the wastewater for the veterans' home. And you've been doing recycled water since the mid-1970s, so one of the first agencies really into that recycled water business. And right now you're doing about 127 million gallons of recycled, or 87% of that 127 million gallons. So probably about 100 million gallons of recycled water, quite a bit of recycled water. And I guess that gets turned into expensive wine by irrigating the vineyards with the recycled water. It's very environmentally friendly. And just here's a schematic of your wastewater collection system. And right now your residential rates are flat rates. Bi-monthly charge for single-family home is about $41.77. Multifamily and mobile homes are charged a fraction of that, about 73% of the single family, and that's $30.58 bi-monthly. And that tracks with the actual winter water use, which we assume to be similar to the discharge profile.
A question on that?
Yeah.
So a single-family house gets $41.77. If I go into one of the mobile home parks, each individual unit
Correct.
there is being charged $30.58.
Correct.
Is there a reason for the difference?
Yeah, when we looked at the water flow, in the wintertime, we assume most of your water consumption goes back down the sewer. In the summer, there's a lot of irrigation. So we looked at the winter water records, and we found that your mobile home and multifamily customers were, on average, about 73% of your single-family flow.
Okay.
So that tracks very, very well with the cost of service.
Thank you.
I don't understand that. Why, how could that be? I mean,
Just
Usually it's
less occupancy, I guess.
Yeah,
Oh,
fewer
fewer
people
people
and
in
smaller
the-
units. And
thank you.
Right now, your non-residential rates, you've got a fixed charge, and there's three categories: low, medium, and high-strength fixed charges, and they vary by meter size. And you'll notice your medium rate is lower than the low rate, which is a result of not implementing the full rate structure that was proposed about 5 years ago.
7.
Yeah. So that we're going to address that in our rate study. And you also have a volume charge per billing unit, which is 1,000 gallons. And that varies based on strength of wastewater, low, medium, and high. And there's a charge of $1.32.6 for low strength discharge, $1.87 for medium, and then $4.87 for high strength wastewater. And in those categories, we have low strength at church, schools, group homes, other commercial in town. Medium strength would be like hotels or inns, other commercial, bars and multi-commercial. And then high strength is your restaurants and tasting rooms. And that's based on the strength of the wastewater that needs to be treated.
And what they mean by strength is that there's a treatment process we have at the treatment plant. It's both based on what's called biological oxygen demand. So we have to treat it a certain amount to decontaminate. Mostly it's fats, oils, grease, that kind of stuff. And then also solids. So we have, the grit chamber, and we have to take that out of the settling, at the treatment plants. So if you have a restaurant, then there's a lot more things coming down the sewer than if you're at a church. The hotels and inns, you have people with showers and things like that. So that's sort of how these were divided up in terms of the strength, which is how much do we have to do to treat the wastewater from each of these types of residence or business, or these are all non-residential subdivisions.
So this would be different, and Vice Mayor Chilton brought up the issue of, was there a different taxing on the system from one water user to another within the same meter size? This would be an example of where that is the case. This is taxing or using up more of the whole system, so that's why the difference in charges.
Right, if we didn't have any restaurants in town, then we'd spend a lot less money treating the wastewater.
Then may I ask why, single family per dwelling unit, it's 41, it's the most expensive?
No, it's totally
Actually,
separate.
that is your non-residential chart you're looking at.
I'm
And
looking
then-
at the residential sewer service charge.
The
Right.
4177.
There's
41 is bi-monthly per
Bi-monthly.
single family.
Okay.
And then on the non-residential, we've got
Two
rates from
I see.
very
You combine
49.
the two.
Sorry.
and up.
That's
Yeah.
okay. No, that's.
Yeah. These are complicated rates.
Well, I also, actually, Councilmember Dornbecker brings up a good thing that we need to point out. The residential rate does not have a load factor, because we've already determined that there's a consistency in the, for lack of a better word, the single-family product. The load factor comes on our non-residential, which is not, unfortunately for us, it's also, we don't have that many. So I think that is actually a good clarification to bring. So when you see the load factor, it's actually applying to a relatively small number of accounts, but it is fairly significant because, as Public Works Director Wadsworth identified, that really drives the effort that we have to do to break up that and treat that. You know, if we were 100% single-family homes, we'd have a very easier way about how we go about business than we do with fats, oils, and grease. I will also say, since we do not have industrial components and solvents and a lot of other stuff, we don't have amongst the most complicated, and in fact, compared to City of Napa or American Canyon, our treatment is a bit easier.
Thank you.
This is just an example calculation for those non-residential customers. This is a medium-strength customer with a 2-inch meter using 90 billing units of water. So the fixed charge will be $77.45, and the volume charge would be $143.21. And there's an assumption that 85% of the water...
We took 85% of the 90 billing units to get 76.5.
Yeah, assuming 85% of the water that you consume through your water meter goes back down the sewer. And so that's how that rate works.
Isn't 77 and 140?
Oh, yeah, it's a rounding thing. I have, yeah.
It's one rounding. It's like 215.
Isn't it? Oh, it is 370.
It's all right.
I think there's a typo on that number. It looks like
Nah.
it should be in the 240s just
Yeah,
off my head.
it's all right.
Sorry.
That's okay.
I think that's more billing units that I was changing, and I didn't change this. I apologize.
It's okay.
I think I'm-
It's an example, I understand.
Yeah, it's actually less.
Okay. Summary of your sewer accounts. You've got 628 residential accounts, again, 2 mobile home accounts, 560 single families, and 66 multifamily accounts. And the number of dwelling units is 1,153. So you have 628 accounts, but 1,153 dwelling units on that. And then non-residential, we have 25 low-strength accounts, 35 mediums, and 16 high-strength accounts, for a total of 76. And your wastewater financial funds, you've got the basic wastewater utility operating fund, number 62, which accounts for your wastewater revenues for operating and paying operating expenses. And inside that, you have the wastewater collection system operations and the wastewater treatment operations. And that's important because you don't charge the veterans home for your collection system. That's just town cost. The veterans home only pays for treatment for their share. They don't pay for your collection system. You've got a joint treatment capital recovery fund, number 63, a wastewater capital improvements fund, number 64, and that accounts for your sewer collection system capital projects. And then we've got sewer connection impact fee fund, number 65, for any connection fees that come in. And the fund balances here, we've got about $62,000 in the operating fund, almost $1 million in the capital improvement fund, a deficit of $571,000 in the joint treatment fund. So that's been lent some money from the capital improvement fund, and then your connection fee fund is at zero. So the total there, you've got about $488,000 in the wastewater funds.
Can I ask, could you, for public benefit, clarify that $570,000 deficit?
Yes, that's going to be a transfer from the wastewater utility capital improvement fund, and that was to fund, we advanced money to the Veterans Home to complete the wastewater treatment plant improvements, and then they're going to pay us back over a 6-year period. 8-year period.
Thank you.
So what's driving the need for the rate increases? Well, we've got an operating deficit, and that will continue to grow without any rate increases. You've got capital improvements, more so than in the water enterprise. You've got a 5-year total of $2.4 million in wastewater projects that are needed, and those are needed to meet your discharge permit with the state. And so you've got to upsize your recycled water distribution pumps and other facilities by December 1st of 2013. And so that's driving the need for that $2.4 million reclaimed water project. And so we're recommending applying for a low-cost loan from the state revolving fund that's currently 2.6% interest, 20-year money. And a lot of our clients have used that and are using that. The money is readily available, believe it or not. And you also have operating cost increases with your general O&M and personnel services. Graphically, we're seeing here we've got capital in the yellow, and the green is your collection system O&M, and then transfers to the capital funds is the blue. So capital improvement projects is the yellow. You can see our revenues are below what we need to make these payments. The 5-year CIP, we've got a big jump in 2013-14, but the total is $2.4 million. And then briefly about the state revolving fund loan, the SRF. It's a 20-year loan. The interest rate is half of the state's general obligation bond rate. And the first payment of debt service is not due until 1 year after your project is complete. So that's a huge benefit. If you just borrowed money with a municipal bond, you'd have to start paying 6 months generally after you borrow the money. So this delays your first payment and lets you phase in rate increases. You do have to maintain a coverage of the revenues that have to be 120% of your debt service. But that's a pretty standard covenant for a borrowing. And the town needs to show that it has adopted the rates that will provide the sufficient revenue to pay for the loan before it can qualify for the loan. So in the past, they would let you adopt the rates after you got the loan. Well, that didn't work out. One agency didn't adopt the rates. So now you have to adopt the rates before you get the loan.
So I'm sorry, Mayor Dunbar. I have one question with regards to the debt service payment, and it says not due till the 1 year after the project is completed.
Right.
Who defines when the project is completed? Is it when it's up and
Good
functioning?
question.
Is it when it was placed in service? What's the... is there a technical term or something that we would be obligated to prove?
Well, what usually happens, the town's policy is to file a notice of completion and accept the project. So when the council says, we accept this project as our responsibility to maintain, then at that point, we would let the state know, and then we'd start the payment process.
Okay.
And if we didn't file that notice?
Well, the contractor may have issues with us not paying them.
We'll continue that the next meeting.
I
I
think
know
it's
you were going
also,
to ask that next.
I wasn't going to ask that, but it's a good thought.
I do think it's also fair to bring to everybody's attention, somebody might suggest, well, what if we don't do what the state says we need to do in regard to our permit conditions? One, that's a very difficult challenge to put your staff in because there's professional obligations. But the current fine is $10,000 a day for failure to meet and comply with state regional water quality board permit conditions. You may have read about a week ago a little article about districts up in Lake Berryessa where they've actually been assessed several $100,000. So it's not something that we can take lightly. So I just want to stress that. We didn't really talk about that, but a resident did suggest that perhaps we just blow the state off, and I think that was not quite the terminology, but anyway, it is worth sharing because, I mean, what are the consequences? And there are consequences.
So this summarizes the debt service on that loan. If we borrow $2.4 million, 20 years, we assume 3% to be conservative. The debt service will be about $163,000 for 20 years, $163,000 per year. And you do have an existing energy efficiency grant that has annual costs of about $6,500. In the Veterans Home share, the Veterans Home pays 50% of all costs related to the joint treatment plant. They don't pay collection system costs because that's just for the town. But for the joint treatment, they pay half. And you can see here you've got the funding, total Veterans Home expenses about $400,000 for the current year. And that's projected to increase to about $650,000 by 2015-16, and that includes the debt service on the loan and the capital recovery for capital costs, and also the depreciation funding that we're proposing to build into this, and that phases in over a number of years. So cost is increasing for the Veterans Home there. The rate structure modification. We're recommending that we not have 3 separate fixed charges, that we just have one schedule of fixed charges, but that we keep the 3 user low, medium, and high strength for the volume consumption on sewer. So these would be compressed into one schedule of fixed charges. And then we're also recommending that you have the system replacement fee to fund replacement of facilities as they wear out. And that fee will be shown separately on the bi-monthly bill. And that's phasing in again. It's about $12.19 the first year bi-monthly, and that would go up to $19.20 by the end.
Currently, the operating fund does transfer $50,000 each year to the capital fund, but it really isn't enough to pay for all these capital projects. So we're proposing to increase that amount based on depreciation of the collection system and of the treatment plant.
And if I may, just again to reiterate, as I did with the water rate study, this is inclusive of the rates in the final projection, so we'll be reviewing. So this
Correct.
is not, again, incremental, although it says it's separate.
Right.
Yeah, okay. On the bill. Thanks.
And then we, developed the rate scenarios by doing 10-year cash flow projections, projecting revenues and expenses. We built in the wastewater system replacement fee costs, and also the rates are set to meet the debt service coverage requirements on that state revolving fund loan. So option one is where we would not borrow money. This is pay-as-you-go only and would require two 55% annual revenue increases. Would have a significant impact on customers. And you can see in 2011-12, there would be a $23 bimonthly increase on the residential wastewater rate, and then a $35.61 bimonthly increase the following year. And the rate would go up from currently $41.77 bimonthly to slightly over $100 bimonthly in that scenario. And also on the commercial, same type of increases. You're going to see very substantial increases with this scenario. $326 bimonthly increase in 2011-12, and then $407 bimonthly the following year. So very substantial there. So option one, we're not really recommending. I think option two is one where we would phase in the rate increase more gradually and use the state revolving fund loan. We would have 16.5% increases on the revenues, and this would allow us to build up our fund balance to a healthy level and also maintain the debt service coverage on the loan. You can see in 2014-15 is our first year where we have to show the coverage, and we were at 1.27, which is above the 1.2 minimum. And the way these rates would look, residential would see about a $6.89 bi-monthly increase. The rate in the first year, rates would gradually go up from $41.77 to $48.66 the first year, then $56.69, and then up to about $89 bi-monthly in 2015-16. So this is far below the $100 bi-monthly from option scenario one. And also for the multifamily and commercial, they would have similar increases. Commercial would see about a $142 bi-monthly increase the first year. Scenario three is basically a back-loaded scenario where we would have lower increases the first couple of years and then higher increases on the last 2 years. We'd have 14% the first 2 years, then 19% the second two, and then a 6% increase the final year. Again, this kind of softens the blow in the early years. You would see about a $5.85 bi-monthly increase on residential the first year, followed by a $6.67 increase the second year, and then a $10.32 bi-monthly increase the third year, and so on. It's a matter of your preference, which scenario you pick. They're all going to meet the revenue needs for the utility. And then just to put those in perspective, your current wastewater rate is again the lowest in the surrounding communities, $41.77 bi-monthly. Even with the increases, you'd still be the lowest. Napa Sanitation District's coming in about $71.50 bi-monthly, all the way up to Calistoga's $102.16 bi-monthly. And Healdsburg's higher at about $128.67 bi-monthly.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
Can we go back one slide? So I guess I'm confused on scenario 2 versus scenario 3. I would think that if we're backloading rates in scenario 3, that we would therefore be collecting more money in the out years than we would in scenario 2. the chart doesn't show that, to make up for the money we didn't get in the first place?
Go back one slide.
Because it makes it look like scenario 3 is just cheaper.
Well, it is. But compared to scenario 2, where you have the even annual rate increases, the
Yeah.
16.5, you'd be collecting 16.5% additional revenue for those first 2 years, as compared to the first 2 years of wastewater scenario 3. You'll be collecting 14%. So that 16.5 actually gets compounded.
Okay. But if I go to 2015-16 on both of them,
You get lower rates for scenario 3.
correct. But I also get it in 2011-12. Get it every year. It just seems like, there's no free lunch out there, right?
50.
Back in 13,
Lewis, where you catch up is in years 13, 14, and 14, 15. You move ahead.
Scenario 3 looks,
That's when you take the big hit for a lot of the permit requirements that come due in 13, 14. That's why it goes down again, because that's when we're going to spend a lot.
Excuse me? I'm sorry. I didn't.
I guess the difference is so little that it just doesn't show that. I guess I look at that 2015-16 year and see a difference of 8150 versus 8964 in that final year.
I think the real challenge we had here,
And that's substantively lower at that point.
Yeah.
Even though it's supposed to be backloaded.
If you look at scenario 2, we're showing a little more net revenue in that final year under scenario 2. That's probably why the rate's a little higher.
Okay.
We could probably trim that down a little bit. Or, scenario 3,
I see.
Has
The
lower.
ending fund balance is what, $140,000 difference?
In wastewater, we have to meet that debt service coverage.
Yeah.
That's why we made the rates. They want you to have at least 120%, but to show a little more is always better. So that's why our wastewater rates we get a higher ending fund balance for our wastewater rates, because we have to meet that debt service coverage requirement.
I guess the other way to look at it is if you look at scenario 2 total revenues in 14-15 was 1.6 million and 15-16 was 1.8, and then if you go to scenario 3, it's 1.6, which is almost identical in 14-15, and then in 15-16 it's 1.7. So instead of having a 16.5% increase with scenario 2 in 15-16, you only have a 6% in scenario 3, 15-16, and that drops it down, that last total revenue number.
Okay.
but I think the real top level thing, what happened here was we put in, in scenario 1, if we did not borrow any money, how high the rates would have to go to really illustrate that it was probably, an evil we were definitely going to have to do, because, without doing that, it just wasn't really going to make sense. But, it's certainly something we can discuss, that, if somebody wants really high rates like that, if we think we can absorb that, it's still on the board. So what we did with 2 was to really, do a flat system. What's going to be the number over 5 years to flatten it out. And 3 was, for the most part, just to kind of throw in another option, really. And we just said, well, let's backload it a little bit and see. We have to have a certain amount of money by 14-15 when all the permit requirements are due. So 6% just kind of was the number that made it make sense after you put something lower and then something higher. So it's more arbitrary than something strongly considering doing that kind of a scenario.
So the needed debt service coverage is 1.2?
1.2, yeah.
Right.
Thank you.
So just a little bit on Prop 218. The fees need to be based on the cost of service, and we've done a cost of service study. The revenues need to be used for the purpose for which the fee was imposed. I think we talked a little bit about that. We can't use wastewater money for parks, and we can't use water money for, general fund. Proportional cost recovery, we need to recover the costs proportionally from each customer class. we need to notice your property owners, and tell them the new, show them the new rate schedule and the new rates and when the hearing is scheduled for. And that must be at least 45 days after you mail the notice. And the rate increases are subject to majority protest. If you get 50% or more of the ratepayers submitting written protests, then you can't proceed with the increase. Another component of the rate study was to look at your miscellaneous fees. And these are just like account establishment fees, shut-off cost fees, water service initiation after shut-off. These are just the basic fees for, handling accounting and setting up accounts and meter installation and stuff like that. So this was just based on an estimate of the costs for actually doing these services for customers. And so these fees are proposed to be adopted, and that these don't need to be part of the 218 process because these are miscellaneous fees. They're not property-based fees. The next steps, we want to receive input from the council. Ideally, we could mail out the Prop 218 notices by the end of this calendar year, end of this month. And that would give us 45 days to have a hearing on February 15th and approval of the rates, and then those would go into effect on March 1st of 2011 for the first phase, and then future rate increases would be effective January 1st of each year beginning in 2012. So that's slide 67. We made it.
Thank you very much. Very, very complicated process that needs very thorough analysis, so thank you. I do want to give the public another chance. Any questions or comments on the wastewater or Proposition 218? No. Okay. One question I'll have just before we kind of return the conversation to council is, do you see a relationship as we analyze the three scenarios you're presenting for water and the three scenarios for wastewater? Meaning, if the council sees a particular scenario as most advantageous in water, do you think that changes the dynamic for our conversation with wastewater?
I think you need to consider the impacts of each. But honestly, I think you can mix and match any alternative from water with any from wastewater.
Okay. Nice, concise answer.
I
Okay.
have a question
You have a question of
of staff.
okay.
And that is, do you, I didn't see anywhere in here what the revenues from the sale of the reclaimed water to Mondavi. I didn't see the actual dollar number. Is it in here?
And do you know it off the top of your head?
Well, total is 26,000, right?
It's about, 26,000 a year. So it is in our budget, but I see Kathleen's looking it up. It is a revenue account, and so we do, when we do sell the water to the users, we take that revenue and put it into an account, and that is taken into account in the rates.
And are there other account users
Yes.
as well?
Yeah, there's about 4 right now.
Or-
I do want to point out, and I think that's a great segue to something. We have a commodity, but we do not have a commodity that can be priced at the equivalent. And what I mean by that is our system requires us to do something with the waste product. Some systems have sludge, and the sludge is hauled off to other places. Ours is the treated, reclaimed water. So in our case, while we do look at and will look at restructuring our reclaimed water agreements as they come up for renewal, we're not at a point where we can completely say, take it or leave it. Here, here's the price, because we actually need to move the product someplace. So it's not a zero-sum game. Conversely, our actual product comparison would be more what the cost of operating an irrigation agricultural well would be. The cost per gallon of water becomes our market comparison for the value of the reclaimed water. And if we price our reclaimed water at a higher rate than what these particular agricultural users can produce from their own irrigation wells, they're going to say sayonara. And we still have a need to move the product. So that's why I do think it's important to note that we have a small, but I will say probably at this point a negligible revenue stream from the reclaimed water. It is something that in the current generation, as they come up, we are going to look at, especially at dealing with some of the capital component. So that is, I think, a good question to kind of bring everybody to a full circle of where we need to be at in this particular Regional Water Quality Board permit and planning cycle for the next 5 years.
And I'd also like to add, we have a very limited distribution system for that water, so it's not like a lot of people who might like to have it can't get it because we don't have pipes that go to them.
Thank you.
What I was going to do next was ask Councilmember Moeller, since she's the only ad hoc committee member here, if there's anything else. I know you've made some comments and asked some questions already, but is there anything else that you wanted to bring back from the ad hoc committee conversations before we complete our council discussion?
I just have some general comments from some of the notes that from the numerous meetings that we did have. First, I'd like to say that I feel pretty confident that there's probably not one single council member here who wants to raise any of these rates, and that but we did have to consider that the goal of our public water system was to provide our customers with some uninterrupted supply of safe and dependable and fairly priced water and sewer rates while operating at a break-even financial situation. And then in order to meet these goals, we really needed to look at all these rates. And the overriding thing that kept coming up over and over was that we wanted the rates to be fair and equitable. And by fair, we mean that the rate was going to be high enough to cover the full cost of the system, and equitable meant that each class of the customer was paying its fair share of the cost. So when we considered each one of these parameters and all the scenarios, that I think is very important for the public to realize that really were the principles that guided a lot of our choices and how we disregarded some of the scenarios and left everybody with these to consider tonight. And as we also know, our enterprise funds cannot be used to pay for any other municipal services, so they are closed funds. Also, I think our customers should know what our rates are, and that will come out in the Prop 218. But we might also want to consider posting our rates someplace in our town office, so people at any time can really kind of come in, especially since this is going to be new, and take a look at that. And I think overall, from what you've seen here, that the way we're going to be able to present it to the public is in a pretty easy, even though it's very complicated, we're going to do everything we can to put it in an easy to understand format for everybody. And I think another thing that we talked about was on an annual basis, especially since this is going to be, we're going to be doing the budget on an annual basis, is to really revisit each one, whatever we do choose, to make sure that we're tracking along schedule, what the pass-through costs are going to be, and notice the public that if we don't need a pass-through cost, make sure they know that too. But this should be revisited on an annual basis because things might come up unexpected today in terms of expenses or revenues, and so a close monitoring of this will, I think, be important. So I think the key variables we need to really think about tonight in terms of the water is, do we think the Veterans Home is going to charge us 7.5% or 10% in the future? And you can see from Table 8, over the last 4 years, they've charged us an average of about 10.8%, but the rate of that increase has been going down. So that's why the 7.5 is, I think, what the ad hoc council and our consultants, with their help, are recommending. And then we have the pass-through charge. So that's where we've come up with that. And the fixed and variable is certainly going to probably need some discussion, but again, based on a lot of analysis, the 50/50 is not only going to smooth things out over wet years and dry years, but the 50/50, I think, is probably the most fair and equitable as well, based on a lot of analysis. So, and also we used the phase-in over 5 years because that was, when we first brought the topic up, the general consensus of the council was to phase in these rates over a 5-year period. So, that being said, we're ready to talk.
I no longer have to ask you what your preferred scenarios are. You just kind of covered that, I think. I did want to go back over to make sure and confirm your recommendations, just also so the public doesn't have to search through the report necessarily, but you're recommending scenario 2, as Councilmember Moeller just stated, the 7.5% escalation number and a 50/50 fixed versus variable allocation.
Correct.
For the water, and for wastewater, again, scenario number 2.
Correct.
Which is including the $2.4 million loan and an even annual rate increases over the 5-year period.
Right.
Okay. And, let's see, was there, well, with that, let's have council discussion. We've heard from Councilmember Moeller. If Councilmember Hall would like to continue.
Yeah, first of all, I'd like to say thanks. I can tell there's been a lot of hard work that's gone into this from, obviously, you guys, Board of Wells, the Ad Hoc Committee. Thanks, Margie and staff. I know this is, it's a delicate topic. It's one where there's going to be some difficulty. People on fixed incomes, if we come out with rate increases, they're not going to be easy to absorb. But in general, I would say I am not for subsidies, and the town has done that. We know for the last 10 years, and unfortunately, we're in a situation where we're going to have to be able to maintain and provide the high level of services that our residents demand. We're going to have to make some sort of adjustment here, and obviously, there's been a lot of good work to provide scenarios we can look at and evaluate. I want to make it clear, though, for us as a council, you know, we've already funded this to some extent, about $3 million. That money, if we had it today in our pockets, maybe we could make some different choices here, but we don't. We've used that money, and hopefully the people who benefited from that, the residents of this town and the businesses, they've been able to do something with that $3 million that they were provided. That said, the other choice that we, hasn't been put on the table, but certainly we could think about, I don't think it's one that's one we should consider, but the town does provide the water services, and the alternative would be to outsource this to a third party. And we could only imagine what those rate increases might be if we were to bring in a third party who would try to make this a profit center. Certainly it would be different because they'd have the same infrastructure costs, asset costs, and depreciation we do, but then they might also need to fulfill something for their board of directors or owners or investors. So that in mind, I recognize there's a lot of moving pieces to this. I think most of my questions were answered. I do feel comfortable with the analysis that's out there. I agree with the direction that we've proposed and presented. I think there is clearly some messaging that we're going to have to work with as a council to ensure that the residents who are going to be, ourselves included, but the residents who are going to be affected by this understand. I mean, these are very complex issues, and how we present that to them in a manner that is acceptable is going to be important. And I want to go back to this because this topic of messaging is going to be really critical, especially as we consider that Proposition 218 and the outcome of that, or lack thereof, if there is enough protest. What are our alternatives if there is a protest? Is that a question I can ask? Do we know what would we do if more than 50% of the people did protest?
The proposed rate increase would be stopped. and the town would have to come up with a completely different scenario and start the process over, which would obviously mean the council would have to come up with some level of continued subsidy or structure during that interim. But that a 50+1 effectively stops the proposed rate increase that was initiated.
And Steve, there was a handout also for both the water and the wastewater that would show the subsidy.
Thank you. That provides a good segue.
Okay.
If the rate increase or some factor is not improved, you're looking at, and this gives it to you roughly by fiscal year, there could be some fine tuning, but you're looking at a continued subsidy of $2.74 million over 5 years would be necessary for the wastewater, and $2.169 million over the 5-year period for water. The challenge to the council then would be basically to completely go through the current annual budget and figure out what you're going to eliminate in terms of your services, because our revenue stream is fixed. And for those of you that aren't familiar, we have a nice little chart called the Budget in Brief, which highlights where our revenues come from and where the expenditures go. Property tax is approximately $814,000. TOT is about $3.35 million. And then sales tax is $711. Those are the three most significant general fund revenue sources. And you're looking at having to cover this potentially with general fund. And then conversely, your expenses, we spend about a little over 1.3 on law enforcement and fire. So it would be a very challenging conversation for the council on where we would reorganize the existing services and frankly at this point what you would trim and do differently.
Well, Stephen, let me just thank you for that, and also say that by running these funds, both the water enterprise and the wastewater enterprise funds, at a break even and setting aside the necessary appropriations for future maintenance and ongoing support of these fixed assets and the infrastructure we need to maintain, basically is like running, effectively giving money back to the town, because we're not going to have to find money in our general fund or otherwise to fund those activities. So not running these at a deficit is critical, because we don't have to make those changes that I believe many of us are settled with in the town. I do have just a couple of general questions or comments about how we or where we decide to identify, I believe, for the water rate study, $220,000, which fund we might choose to do that from. I'm not necessarily indifferent to it. I think the general fund is just a little over $1 million at this point in time, and certainly with council discussion, we could maybe go further as to where we think whether that's the right choice to take 20% of our general fund for this kind of action should we go forward, or whether we look at and take the appropriation, or should we decide to do that from the water, from the drought fund. I'm open to either scenario, but I do believe, because we would be borrowing against the town, we should certainly consider and implement some sort of rate of return. These are monies that, although we don't believe they are at risk, they would be at risk. We cannot predict what will happen in the future. We don't have a crystal ball. And I did have some general thoughts around the way we could soften the blow further, Graham. I'm not sure exactly. I did go through the capital budgets, and I noticed almost all the projects were high priority. I think in the water rate study there was one that was the fire blowout or whatever it was called, which was a low priority of roughly $50,000. But it seems to me that everything that's in the capital improvement projects were necessary, and I know that would be something we could maybe evaluate. But going forward, the only other issue or challenge I see with regards to the information that was provided, because I do appreciate and believe the recommendations provided by the committee and our consultants are appropriate, is that I just want to make sure that we're messaging what we do to our constituents properly. This is not going to come easily. These will be big numbers, especially for people on a fixed income, and it's important they recognize that we're doing this for the betterment of the town. So, I don't know if that helped.
Thank you very much for your comments. And I think we will have to have a conversation about where the council is comfortable with, if we are, in fact, loaning ourselves that money, one, where the source, and two, if there's going to be a no or a fixed rate of return on that. So
If I
if
can
that
just-
conversation needs to happen tonight,
It actually doesn't, and it's
Okay.
not on your agenda for you to act upon it, but it is from a discussion standpoint. And I do want to remind everybody, and then Kathleen can, or Doug and Kat, we actually have loans for both. So you're looking at roughly order of magnitude, mid-fours total. So that's why keeping your options open are helpful, and I'll just leave it at that. And we do hope to have a end-of-year status report shortly that could be favorable as well.
Yes, that's what I wanted to add. We're completing the CAFR. We'll be bringing that forward in first meeting in January, along with an overview of how we've ended the year. And the general fund will have some unallocated reserves, so waiting till that time might be prudent, so you have all your options available.
so what I want to make sure, and I'll go to Councilmember Dornbecker for her comments next, but at the end of all these comments, if staff would like to basically roll call some of these details, I feel like we have a few issues I want to make sure are perfectly clear, which is just saying scenario 1, 2, or 3 doesn't give you all the direction. We need to know what maximum percent we're talking about within certain scenarios, correct?
Actually, when you do say that, the scenarios actually are detailed well. They do have a drill-down rate and system fee component that have all been identified. So
Okay, so the 7.5 versus the 10%, that's already,
you tell us,
Okay.
right, that's all factored. That's why, so in this particular case, you do have, that gives us pretty good direction. If you wanted to do something completely different than either of those scenarios, you certainly have that option, although that will probably keep you here a lot longer.
so what I'd like to do, and just to summarize, you're supporting scenario 2 in both cases, water and wastewater, correct? Councilmember Moeller.
Right, and
Okay.
so in scenario 2, in the water, that's assuming that the Vets Home is going to be charging a 7.5% water rate for the next 5-year increase, and it's got the 50/50 component.
Right, okay.
So
and-
that's
And Councilmember Hall, your scenarios are what exactly?
Both scenario 2 for the wastewater and scenario 2 for the water rate.
Okay, thank you.
No.
So, Councilmember Jordan, back to your comments, and then if you would, at some point, just be very specific about your scenario choices.
All right, well, I anticipate that this is going to cause quite a stir in the community, and having been a Californian for many, many years, I remember in 1976 in San Francisco, we had mandatory water rationing. So I think that a component of our messaging to the community should have something to do with conservation, education, some component of it, to encourage it, because it, there are some very common sense things that can help people to deal with some of the increase when they decrease the amount of water that they use. And I also believe that going forward, we should be proactive in looking for ways to mitigate the kinds of expenses, and that, to me, entails looking for grants from the feds or other organizations that might be able to help us to create infrastructure that could deal with the gray water for for homes. So that's going forward and in the future. But I do think that, those have to be how we look at water out into the future. And at this particular time, I believe that it would be, as long as there were the kinds of return and everything built into the loan of the money from the drought fund, I believe that that would be appropriate since that is a water-related fund. But I'm open to that, but and could be dissuaded from that if the general fund could handle it. And lastly, I also am most comfortable with the 50-50 of scenario 2 for the water and also scenario 2 for wastewater.
Thank you very much. Vice Mayor Chilton.
Just so you guys know, you guys lucked out because we had this discussion on my very first council meeting. You all had an extra week to think about it. So welcome to the council. This is the fun. This is the fun part of it. I remember, I guess it's 4 years ago now, essentially, when we had this discussion. And one of the real concerns that I had about the previous rate structure had to do with, one of which had to do with conservation. We did put in a conservation rate structure, which to me was a really good thing to do. And the one thing I didn't like about it is I didn't think it properly accounted for the differences between usage in terms of this town's unique characteristic of second home ownership and very small occupancy households. And that is one of the reasons that I think that the 50-50 structure makes a tremendous amount of sense, because we are talking about averages, and in certain cases, if you have somebody who has a home, they are a second homeowner, they don't use much water because they're here on the weekend, they may be doing irrigation, I kind of felt like we were giving them a break, an unfair break over people who were our regular residents that maybe had a couple of children, et cetera. So I think that the 50-50 split makes a lot more sense. I also think it makes sense from the fact that on the conservation side, one of the ironies of encouraging conservation, which if you look at the town development over the last even 5 years, the fact that water usage has stayed flat or even gone down a little bit, we're ironically then turning around and penalizing our users for saying, thanks for saving us that water, and by the way, you need to pay more for the new water because you did the right thing. And we saw that with the tolls and on the bridges, is that enough people were using carpools, which is what we want them to do. That what do? They put in a $250 a toll on carpools because there wasn't enough money coming in, and that kind of perverse incentive, I think the 50-50 helps eliminate that. And it does eliminate the need for us to come back and say, hey, we had a rainy year, you guys didn't use much water, thanks, but we're going to have to make an adjustment down the road because you did that. So I think that's the real positive of the rebalancing. So for that reason, I definitely support the 50-50. My biggest concern has been the phasing in, and we talked about that approach. And my real concern has to do with even the first year. If I've done my numbers right, using the single-family residence average, the first year monthly, not bi-monthly, but monthly bill will go up about $14. On a percentage-wise, it's pretty high. $14 is $14. And I think that Councilmember Hall made the point. For some of us, $14 is not that big of a deal. For a lot of people, it is, especially fixed income. Social Security had no cost of living increase last year. So that is my number one concern about this. And I think that I think that's one thing that we need to get feedback. This is the first step in the process from the public about their concerns about that. The flip side of that is government. I think the state of California has played this game. Our federal government is certainly playing this game today, which is closing its eyes to the future and saying, I want now, give it to me now, now. Don't care what comes. And we have been in an enviable position over the last 10 years that we had, I think, really the extra revenue to subsidize lower water rates. And the real question is, are we going to go down a road that 3 or 4 years from now we're going to put our citizens in a real crunch? And I think the responsible answer to that is we should not do that. We have taken steps on retirement reserves. I think our water enterprises is another good example. That do any of us want to pay? Everybody on this council is going to pay. Do we want to pay higher rates? Absolutely not. Do we want to look down 10 years in the road and say, well, we kind of took it from you and now you get stuck with the bill? I think that's irresponsible. So that's my reluctant reason for knowing that I think this is necessary, even if undesirable. I have had a reasonable amount of comment as saying, hey, in the past we funded it, the deficits with the subsidy. And I do thank staff for putting together this chart, which has been distributed. I think we should put on the website or include, that says that over the last 10 years we've subsidized $3 million of water rates, and over the next 5 years we would need to subsidize $6 million. So if you go down and look at the line items in the town and say, I want to continue a subsidy to not pay any more, you've got to tell us where that's going to come from, because that's a huge chunk. And if I look at our expenditures, we could take away our entire Parks and Recreations program, and that doesn't cover the subsidy. Law enforcement and fire emergency, that's the same number, $1.2 million. So we're obviously not going to do that. So I ask people, if that is your position, and I understand I don't want to pay either, but what is the alternative realistically that you would like us to pursue? And that's why we're going to have these public meetings to discuss those type of things. So I support 50-50. I am skeptical. Councilwoman Mueller repeatedly said there's a caveat at 7.5%. So I think that if we go down scenario 2 on both of them, especially the water rate, I think we need to do that with eyes wide open. And everybody needs to understand that we are not promising that will, over 5 years, cover it, but we think that it's a reasonable assumption based on the last couple of years' experience that we're doing that. And really, in a discussion in the public to come, if you're not comfortable with that, the 10%, I think, is only a couple dollars more per month. And if we don't want to have this discussion, if it's more than 10%, then we obviously have some issues to deal with. So I support 1 or 2. I think those are both reasonable scenarios in the water fund, and I support scenario 2 in the wastewater.
Thank you very much, Vice Mayor Chilton. And I'll try just to comment on items that have not already been identified. One thing that I just wanted to remind folks is, and I want to give credit to previous council and staff for having the foresight, one, to invest in a municipal well. That gives us some extra flexibility now and in the future to potentially tap into that drought reserve fund and not be at risk like we would be if we were completely reliant on purchasing of water. Related to that was also the foresight to sell our North Bay concurrent water rights, which created that $2 million fund, where that was money that was basically insurance money for water we never got year after year at $250,000. So I think those two earlier efforts are making a really difficult situation less difficult than it would be. And that's something to remember as we're moving forward. I think it's been a very enviable position that previous councils and this council have been in to be able to subsidize our resident and business water rates. Looking at the numbers for the rest of the community, you can just see that there's been a great benefit for a number of years that people have been able to enjoy, and hopefully that will help make this a little more palatable. I think Councilmember Hall alluded to that also, because we certainly are trying to moderate how much impact this has on our community. But I also think that it's critical that we continue to protect and maintain a high level of service to our community. The conversation, I think, is going to be very important with the community about where this internal loan is going to come from, whether it be the general fund or the drought reserve fund. But I do think that the fact that we even have a drought reserve fund now is critical. I think and Vice Mayor Chilton talked about conservation. It's still critical that we keep conservation a priority, but it does impact ironically and negatively, our water revenues. So that is an ongoing balancing act. So with all the analysis, and I appreciate the consultant and the ad hoc committee really kind of boiling these things down to a few understandable, first of all, and kind of identifiable scenarios. I too find it most important to balance out the 50-50 revenues in scenario 2. So I would support the water rate scenario 2 summary. I really struggle between the wastewater scenarios 2 and 3 because I like the idea of that delayed increase or the delayed spiking given the climate we're in and the impacts we're talking about on people's monthly or bi-monthly costs. But as was also alluded to, we had this conversation just a few years ago and we started to implement change and then we stopped. And now we're halfway down that road that if we continue down that road, this is going to look like it would have been a real bargain. I think we can no longer ignore this. We have to address the subsidy and the deficiencies now, and it will be a bit of a bitter pill, but not nearly as bitter as if we continue to pretend this isn't a problem. So I would support the wastewater scenario number 2 also. It feels like a fair middle ground. It balances out the impact. It's going to be a bit of a hit early, but then I think we can, it's important to be able to budget annually what monies we have coming in, to count on that, and households and businesses could also budget evenly. So we still have plenty of work to do, I think, to make sure that the community understands what we're talking about and that we can get feedback from our residents and our business community. But I do think that this is really a decision that we can no longer afford to put off. So with that, does staff need additional feedback? I know there was a half a dozen potential recommendations. Vice Mayor Chilton, one more comment?
I did pass over on accident the question of where funds would be loaned from. I believe fairly strongly that they should not come from the general fund reserves. I think that's for the operation of the town, and I think that personally I believe that it should come from the drought fund. And as Councilor Moeller pointed out, it's probably a 2 or 3 year horizon at least before we would get into a situation we'd have to use that in severe drought. And so far this year, I think we're on the right track. So, so I think that we would have enough time to adjust and know, wow, we're 2 years into a serious drought and our municipal well is starting to get stretched. So I think the risk from that fund is not that high. If we took it out of the general fund and we had something severe in the economy, for example, I think that risk is greater. So that's my position right now on that.
Thank you, Vice Mayor. Now, staff, are you comfortable with, clearly there's a consensus of the scenarios. Do you need formal action on these recommendations, or can you
I'm
tell
going
us?
to be brief and direct. Yes, when you adopt the resolution, you will need to include scenario number 2 for water, scenario number 2 for wastewater, if that is the consensus of the council or the motion maker. The question about the loan sources, we will schedule for another agenda. What I can comfortably tell you, and I think Kathleen will agree, we have a resource structure between several alternatives that will provide for the softening, and then the council can make the final decision on where the funds for the rate softening loans for both water and wastewater need to come. Your feedback's been very helpful because it puts us halfway there. But we can put together some input on those, and that'll come back to you for a later agenda item. I hear very strongly the council talk about message. I couldn't agree more. We spent a lot of time in the draft Prop 218 notice, as you probably have identified, on really trying to tell the story, and the story is relatively simple. On water, it's purchasing. It's the cost has gone up. And in wastewater, it's the need to put $2.4 million in a relatively short period in system improvements. It's a very straightforward story. We resolve those, but that is exactly what we have to work on, messaging. I think the idea about public relations, about talking about how you can save money, how you can, if you want to reduce your water bill, you can do things. So I think those are some good things with your help that we can help to do. And, the other item that staff is recommending that we hold a public workshop, and I think consensus support for that. But the action tonight would be those identified in the resolution with inserting the appropriate rate scenario.
And before we move on to any action, I'd just like to clarify for everyone, including the public, on the process. Through public discourse, there may be, or can there be adjustment, I'm sure there can be adjustment of these scenarios, and what would the process then be if through public conversation, council wants to make any modifications? Can you explain that? Is that possible, or does it start all over again and the whole process will start?
Again, tonight, you're setting with the Prop 218 notice the maximum rate structure that we can charge. On February 15th, the council could choose, assuming, well, let me go back through the first scenarios. If you have a 50+1 greater property owner protest, it stops. If you don't have a 50+1 property protest, then the council can implement a rate increase.
I think it's important to add 50%, not just the number 50.
The council can adopt the rate increase, or the council could adopt a lesser rate increase. So, if you choose to do something different, you have that option. We'd have to map all that. But, for example, as you now have seen when we talk about this, when we talk about on rate revenues, it's also, there's some, how it's distributed. So, but that's, the short answer is you can do something at that hearing. You could implement a slightly less overall rate increase than what you're telling us, but you could not implement a greater.
Thanks for the clarification. So is there council action?
I could like to, would you like a motion? I would like to make a motion that we accept resolution number 2936-10, consideration of filing and receive water and wastewater financing plan and rate study 2010 consultant report, utility rate ad hoc committee recommendations, and call for the notice of public hearing and establishing procedures for the utilization of Prop 218 majority protest procedure regarding proposed water and wastewater rate adjustment with the insertion of scenario 2 from the rate study report for water rate increases and scenario 2 from the same report for wastewater rate increases.
Second.
And just for clarification, is that sufficient language for staff?
Yes.
Thank you. So there has been a motion and a second. We'll take a roll call vote, please.
Aye.
Councilmember Mueller,
Yes.
Councilmember Dornbecker,
Yes?
Councilmember Chilton,
Yes.
Mayor Denver.
Yes. So unanimously, that passes. Thank you very much to our consultants. It was very thorough and as clear as it will ever be analysis. So thank you very much, and to town staff as well. With that, shall we move on to item 8, which is closed session? Is there a need for closed session?
Mr. Mayor, no, there is not this evening.
Then we're moving right along to item 9, which is adjournment to town council regular meeting on Tuesday, January 4th of 2011, even though the agenda says 2010, at 5 p.m. Is that correct? Or should that be 6 p.m.?
That should be 6 p.m.
So January 4th, 2011 at 6 p.m. Is there a motion?
Move to adjourn.
As amended. Second.
All in favor?
Aye.